Chapter 21. Reigate. Memory, like a ball of thread, unravels to reveal different colours from those you expected to find. My perception of what happened is changed by the passage of time and a greater understanding of the problems that my mother had to face. It was a combination of events that brought our 18 months in Castle Court to an end, and although I have never thought of it before now, I think that decisions I made were partly the cause of our parents agreeing to try living together again. It must be understood that ending our idyll in our little flat was not what any of us wanted, but circumstances had changed, and our mother found that she could no longer afford our experiment in independence. I quickly became very unhappy with my weekly trips to the Guildhall School of Music. I didn't like my piano teacher and hated practising. I gave it a great deal of thought, but said nothing to Mum, never wanting to disappoint her. Eventually, I came to a decision. I could take no more of it. I would go for my other great love, art. I decided to apply to the local art school without saying anything at home. If I got in, I would tell her. If I didn't, she'd never need to know. I think this might have been the only time in my youth that I deliberately sought to keep her in the dark about anything so important. I applied, went to see the principal, and to my amazement was accepted to start the following September. Because I was not 18 until just after the beginning of the academic year, I was not entitled to apply for a grant until the following year. You would think I'd have had the sense to wait, but when you're young, you're impulsive and impatient, which is strange, considering that you have your whole life ahead of you. How Mum felt about it when I told her, I don't know. She was, as she always was, encouraging. For a while we coped. I was happy. I got a weekend and holiday jobs to give myself some pocket money. I worked weekends at a local chemist's shop, selling over-the-counter medicines, and "A packet of 3 and 9s, please, miss," to rosy-faced men with downcast eyes. During the Christmas holidays, I worked on the Christmas card counter in Woolworths, my hand ripped to shreds by the scratchy glitter. And in the summer holidays, I worked at the local cinema as an usherette. The thought of being paid to see films appealed, but this soon palled when I was watching the same movie for the 15th time in 1 week. Then Mum lost her job with McFisheries. In her little cubbyhole in an office there was an old wooden stool where she sat, taking in money and doling out change and receipts. One day one of her stockings caught on a splinter. She assumed that as her stockings had been ruined by this stool at work, she was entitled to take money from the petty cash to replace them, informing the manager of what she had done. To her astonishment, she was instantly dismissed. This was a disaster in itself, but the final straw to our stretched finances was when she got a very painful slipped disc. For a long time her neck was supported by a stiff collar, and she was unable to work. At the time, I never for a moment connected the fact that I was going to college with our move into a new house with Wilfred. But as the threads of my memory unwind, I find little knots of discomfort that refuse to be untied. Now, in retrospect, I see that my decision to go full-time to art school was possibly a contributing factor that drove Mum to agree to set up home with our father again. She was also encouraged by Sonia. We went to visit Sonia at around this time, and she told us that she had spoken to Wilfred and asked him if he loved his family. He'd replied that he did. I remember being very sceptical about this. "Why does he tell you but never tells us?" "Ah, Christina, your father is a shy man. He finds it very hard to express his feelings." But the feeling remained with me. How could he tell her but not us? I knew she had pushed and pushed until she got the answer she wanted from him, and I knew that as he answered her, he would have given that sniggering little laugh that so irritated me. but Mum persuaded us that it was the right thing to do. Wilfrid seemed keen enough, and why not? He was probably fed up with living with his mother, who was unlikely to respect his vegetarianism, and whose food probably seemed very bland after Mum's continental style of cooking. In June 1962, we all moved into a 3-storey house in Belmont Road, Reigate, in Surrey. We must have lived there for about 5 years, although my parents didn't share a bedroom for very long. Their marriage was really on the rocks long before this experiment in reconciliation. It was never going to work. Mum decided to train as a manicurist with L'Oreal, and for a while worked in the Barry Wolf Salon in Reigate until back problems forced her to give that up. She was to suffer serious back pain for most of the latter part of her life, eventually being diagnosed with osteoarthritis in her spine. It is from my memories of these years in Reigate that I drew threads that lead me, years later, to believe that Wilfrid might have suffered from mild Asperger's syndrome. At the time, none of us knew about this condition, but when I read a description of the repetitive, obsessive behaviour of sufferers, I realise this was probably my father's problem. He was a man of extreme habit and ritual. For example, he could take an hour in the evening to prepare a sandwich to take to work the next day. The bread had to be cut just to the right thickness, the butter spread absolutely evenly and right to the edge but not beyond. The slices of cheese had to match the size of the bread to a millimetre, otherwise an extra sliver would be added, or a corner had to be cut to fit the bread precisely, like a complicated jigsaw puzzle. His sandwich had to be wrapped in exactly the right size of greaseproof paper, and then exactly the right piece of silver foil, all neatly done with crisply folded corners. He always made the same cheese sandwich. Change or variety upset him, and he would become quietly agitated. His actions throughout each day would be as regular and predictable as clockwork. You can imagine how irritating this was, especially to one as spontaneous in her approach to life as my mother. After we had been together a short while, life became so stressful that when Ruth heard Wilfrid arrive home from work, she would instantly get an asthma attack. So accurate was his timing that she could get an attack even a few minutes before he arrived because she was listening for his key in the door. My father was not a bad man. He didn't use physical violence at all. He was a pacifist in belief and deeds, but he was also a man who made it an art to be mean with money, both with his wife and his children. It was always a struggle to get him to pay for anything, and when I was able to apply for a student grant, he took the form away from me, and in secret filled in the part where he had to declare his salary. With himself he was more generous, setting up a darkroom in a small room at the front of the house and buying very expensive cameras and developing and printing equipment. None of us ever knew how much he earned or how much he spent on things for himself. The mental stress of those years took their toll on Mum's health and on any residual affection we might have felt for our father. It was while we lived in the house in Belmont Road in Reigate that a new shop opened in Bell Street, unlike any we had seen before. It was called Jovan and was a tiny delicatessen overflowing with continental foods. German and Belgian salamis, Sevalerwurst and garlic sausages hung from hooks on the ceiling. There were jars of celeriac salad, big, fat, dill-pickled cucumbers in barrels, and jams and fruit compotes from Poland on the shelves. On the counter were German liver sausage and Teewurst, real German Bockwurst, and cheeses we had never heard of before. There was a huge selection of continental breads piled in baskets, and then there were the cakes, poppy seed cake being our particular favourite. This shop was worth going into for the smells alone. My mother was over the moon, At last here was a delicatessen where she could buy all the things she had missed since leaving Germany. The shop was run by a short, plump man in his 50s and his wife, who was head and shoulders taller than he was. When Mum got to know them better, she discovered that the little shopkeeper was in fact a distinguished Serbian violinist, Milan Jovanović Bratsa. He had been a child prodigy, and I believe played for the Tsar of Russia when he was about 6 years old. His performing and recording career under the stage name Bratsa, which was at its peak in the 20s and 30s, had been curtailed by the Second World War, although he still gave occasional recitals with his brother, Duško Jovanović, as accompanist. When he wasn't running his business, he was teaching violin at the Guildhall School of Music, where there is to this day a memorial bursary available in his name. His wife, Margaret Russell, a quietly reserved woman who, in spite of her stature, always seemed to defer to her husband, was a member of a distinguished family of Irish law lords. Mum grew to adore Bratsa and went to buy from his shop as often as she could. Miranda was having violin lessons at that time with a rather second-rate teacher, so Mum made inquiries to see if Bratsa did any private teaching. He told her that he taught on Sundays at his home in Banstead, where he lived with his 2 children. His fees were, of course, considerably more than Mum was used to paying, but somehow she found the money, and Miranda started having lessons with him on Sunday mornings. One day when I was in the delicatessen, I asked Bratsa where the bread came from. It was on that day of the week when he seemed to get all the lovely new breads in, and I was curious to know. "I get up very early while it's still dark and go up to London in my van," he told me. "I drive around to all the specialist bakeries, Polish, German, Greek, Turkish. I fill up my van with bread and cakes and drive back in time to open the shop." And because I'd shown an interest, he then said, "If you're prepared to get up really early one morning, you can come with me." I was thrilled. There was a dewy dampness in the dark air when I left the house a week later to climb into the seat next to Bratsa. "Ready?" "I'm ready." My teeth were chattering, and not only with the cold. I was edgy with excitement. I was not even used to car travel, and this was something completely different, for we were sitting far higher up than in any car. I peered down at the road ahead, lit up by the van's headlights. Most of our conversation is lost to me now, but I do remember that during the ride he suddenly said, "Do tell me if you need the ladies. We all have different bladder capacity." I laughed. I thought the expression so funny, especially coming from this delicious man with his Serbian accent. I'd never heard it before, and it has stuck with me ever since. We watched the sky lighten. Grey mists veiled the Surrey fields, and the shapes of cows and horses huddled beneath trees gradually became visible to us as the morning dawned. By the time the sun was over the horizon, we were driving through the outskirts of London and heading towards the East End. As we went from bakery to bakery, and the wooden shelves in the van filled up, the warm, yeasty smell of fresh bread was overwhelming. Most of the bakeries were small establishments in back streets, and I saw a side of London I hadn't ever seen before. There was something Dickensian about the busy atmosphere in those little alleys. My stomach was starting to grumble. "I always stop at the next place for coffee," Bratsa said. "They're a Turkish family. Have you ever drunk Turkish coffee?" "No, never." "Well, do you usually take milk in your coffee?" "Yes." I did in those days. "Sugar?" "No." "Ha! Well, you won't be offered any milk, and the Turks drink their coffee very strong and very sweet." "Ugh! Try it. It's different, but I think you'll like it. It will certainly keep us awake on our journey back." The Turkish baker was really welcoming and brought us a tray with tiny cups of the densest, most aromatic black coffee I had ever seen or smelt. I gingerly sipped at the syrupy brew. I wasn't all that keen, but the warmth of our host made me persevere. The taste might not have been to my liking, but the after effect was stimulating. Trays of honeyed Turkish cakes were loaded into the van, which was now filled to capacity. We thanked the baker and began our drive back to Reigate through the beginnings of the rush hour traffic, breathing air warmed with aromas of yeast, vanilla, butter, eggs, honey and spices. One Saturday in 1964, Miranda went into the shop and was chatting to Bratza when she happened to mention that she was going to an art school party with me that night. "You'll be up late then," he said. "You won't want to get up early tomorrow. Why don't we skip your lesson for this week? You can have a lie-in." Miranda thought this was a good idea and agreed to cancel her lesson for the next morning. It was when she was walking home from the bus stop after school on Monday that she saw that the delicatessen was closed and there was a notice on the door. When she arrived home, white and shaken, I was already home from the art school. I said something to her, tried to engage her in conversation, but she said nothing. I accused her of being in a bad mood. She remained silent and shut herself away in her room. I didn't know it then, but she later told me that she was unable to speak through fear of how Mum would react to her news. When she arrived home from work, Mum was already in tears. She and Miranda just hugged each other, and at last Miranda cried. I demanded to know what on earth was going on. Mum couldn't believe that my sister hadn't told me. "There's a note in Bratza's shop window. He died, Chrissy. Bratza died yesterday." We later discovered that at the time that he would normally have been given Miranda her violin lesson, Bratza went out into the garden to burn some rubbish. He had a massive heart attack and was found already dead by his family. Miranda tells me that for years she blamed herself, thinking that if only he had been teaching her, he might not have died. You never guess what is going on in the heads of those closest to you. What an unnecessary burden of guilt she put upon herself. If only she could have talked about it to us. Bratza's shop closed, and Bell Street was never again as interesting as it was when that tiny shop brought the first taste of continental food to the little town. We went to Bratza's memorial service at St. Sava's Serbian Orthodox Church near Ladbroke Grove in London. Standing there in this strange incense-infused space, listening to the chanting and watching the robed priests go through their rituals, made me realize that there was a side to Bratza's life that we had never known about. What satisfaction he would have derived in the knowledge that his son Nicholas, just a boy then, is now the Vice President of the newly structured European Court of Human Rights, and since April 2008 has become its first UK judge. Now, apart from finding an old 78 record of him playing Corelli's La Foglia on an obscure internet site, and some brief references about his distinguished career on specialist music websites, this superb musician and warm-hearted and generous man is largely forgotten, but never by us. My 3 years in art school were troubled by money and administrative problems that ended up with me having to leave without the degree I had hoped for. Those 3 years were on the whole very happy ones for me outside our home. I played cello in the Stoneleigh Youth Orchestra and a chamber orchestra in Hawley, conducted by the music master at Miranda's school, and went to orchestral summer schools. I had 2 separate sets of friends, art school and orchestral friends, and the occasional boyfriend. For a couple of years I was even engaged to a boy from art school who Mum particularly, and it turned out rightly, disliked. When I left art school, I worked as a library assistant in the Reigate and Redhill libraries. I quite enjoyed this, as my other great love had always been books and reading. There came a time when Mum suspected that Wilfrid was having an affair. Letters arrived at the house addressed to him in a woman's hand. She had always respected the privacy of other people's private letters or diaries. She wanted to get a legal separation, not such an easy thing to do in those days. A solicitor told her that she had to either employ a private detective or get the proof herself. Eventually she decided that she had to open a letter if she was ever going to find the proof she needed. She was proved right and confronted Wilfrid. As usual, he backed off and went to his dark room, as he always did whenever faced with what he considered an uncomfortable situation. It was never possible to discuss anything with him without him retreating in this way. When Miranda finished her A-levels, Mum paid for her to do a 1-year secretarial course at Mrs. Hoster's Secretarial College in Kensington. She thought it was worth the expense of a private college because Miranda would be employable within a year instead of 3 at a regular college. We all agreed that we had to get away and were planning our escape. I applied for a job in the City of London lending libraries and, like Miranda, began commuting to London every day. As soon as Miranda graduated from the college and got a job in the Oxford University Press music department, we began looking for somewhere to live. Mum had been saving her earnings from several casual jobs so that we could afford to make the move. Sonia, eager to be involved as usual, came to the rescue. As it happened, just at that time, a flat became vacant in Harvard Court in Honeybourne Road, where Sonia lived in West Hampstead. The idea of living there excited us all, and an added incentive was that Hans Werner lived only a couple of miles away in Golders Green. We worked out the cost. With Miranda's and my combined salaries, and if Mum got herself a job, we would cope admirably with the rent and all our living expenses. In the summer of 1967, 5 years after my parents' reconciliation, Ruth, Miranda and I moved into a big Victorian apartment in West Hampstead. After 26 years of marriage, Ruth left with nothing but her clothes and a few sticks of furniture. Wilfrid had the whole value of the house and most of its contents. That was how the law stood then. If a woman left the family home, she left with nothing. 6 months later, the law was changed, and Mum would have been entitled to half the value of the house. Wilfrid never had the decency, even for the sake of his children, to part with anything that he considered his by law. But we were happy nonetheless. For the first time we found ourselves in the kind of cosmopolitan and artistic community in which all three felt more comfortable, and beyond Hampstead were all the exciting and interesting attractions that London had to offer in the swinging 60s. Hampstead was a mix of artists, actors and musicians, Indians, Africans, Polish and German Jews, people of mixed race and many religions. Here it didn't matter if you didn't fit into the British norm. There was a sense of freedom, of excitement at being at the centre of things. It was commonplace to see famous faces on the streets, in shops, sitting at the next table in the restaurant, or when walking on Hampstead Heath. Here you could be unconventional in your dress, in your opinions, and in your dreams. In Hampstead, something of the magic and joy of living was woven once again into our lives. Mum discovered a new interest to absorb her. She joined a ceramics class at the Camden Arts Centre and began coiling pots.